Winter in Chicago was relentless. The wind howled through narrow alleyways, rattling loose trash can lids and whistling between the cracks in old brick buildings. Snow piled unevenly along the sidewalks, untouched except for faint trails left by stray cats and footsteps hurriedly pressed into the slush. The city's lights flickered like distant stars against the cold, but deep in the heart of South Side, the glow barely reached the forgotten corners. Down one such alley, past rusted dumpsters and sagging chain-link fences, Rex trudged through the snow. His paws, cracked and calloused from years of wandering, barely made a sound. Once, his golden coat had shimmered like sunlight, but now it was tangled and darkened with dirt, a stark reminder of how long he'd been without a home. Rex wasn't the only stray dog in South Side, but he was the one everyone seemed to know. "There he is," a child would whisper, pointing as Rex passed by Maple Elementary School's gate. A teacher might glance out the window, watching as Rex padded across the yard during lunch breaks. In the evenings, shopkeepers left small dishes of water or scraps by their doors, knowing he'd come sniffing by. But the only person who ever spoke to him directly was Evelyn Carter. Evelyn's cafe, Eve's Corner, sat nestled between a rundown laundromat and a pawn shop. The building was old, its neon sign flickering more often than not, but inside it was warm, the kind of warmth that lingers long after the last customer has left. Every morning, Evelyn would step outside with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a biscuit in the other. Her hair, once chestnut brown, was now threaded with silver, tied loosely at the nape of her neck. "Morning, Rex," she'd say softly, holding out the biscuit. Rex approached cautiously at first, but over time he learned to trust her. Now it had become routine. Evelyn had long since stopped questioning why the dog lingered near her cafe. Maybe it was because of the food, or maybe, like her, he felt the weight of loneliness. 3 years ago, Evelyn's son, Lucas, died in a car accident. He had been 11. His empty bedroom sat untouched upstairs, dust gathering on his toys. Evelyn stopped visiting the second floor. It was easier that way. Rex never knew Lucas, but something about the dog's gentle eyes reminded Evelyn of him. On colder nights, when the cafe lights dimmed and the streets grew quiet, Evelyn sometimes wondered if Rex was sent to watch over her. But Chicago wasn't always kind. In the past 6 months, 5 infants had gone missing from various low-income neighborhoods. The stories flooded the local news, missing posters plastered on telephone poles, candlelit vigils held in empty lots, but no answers came. Evelyn followed the news closely. Each report stirred something in her chest, a hollow ache that she couldn't shake. She wasn't alone. Fear crept into South Side. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Doors were bolted earlier, and even the most hardened residents spoke in hushed tones about the shadows that lurked too close to home. The night that changed everything began like any other. The cafe had closed hours ago. The streets lay silent beneath a thick blanket of snow. Evelyn sat behind the counter, flipping through old recipes she had no intention of making. Outside, Rex roamed through his usual path along the alleyways. His breath puffed in soft clouds around his muzzle, and his ears twitched at the faintest rustle. Most nights, the streets offered little more than discarded food wrappers and the occasional rat scurrying beneath parked cars. But tonight, a sound. Rex froze, his head snapping toward the far end of the alley. The sound was faint, barely audible over the wind, but distinct. A cry. It wasn't the wail of a cat or the yelp of another stray. This cry was different, softer, fragile. Rex followed it, his paws crunching through the snow as he navigated between dumpsters and stacks of broken pallets. At the alley's edge, tucked against the side of a rusted fire escape, sat a plastic storage bin. The lid was partially cracked, and from within, the cry persisted. Rex circled the bin, sniffing cautiously. His nose nudged the lid aside, revealing a bundle wrapped in a frayed, oversized sweatshirt. A baby. Her face was pale, tiny lips trembling with each breath. The sweatshirt barely shielded her from the cold, and the snow beneath her had already begun to melt from the warmth of her small body. Rex let out a low whine. His instincts screamed at him to act, to protect. Gently, he gripped the edge of the sweatshirt with his teeth, lifting the baby as carefully as possible. As he turned to leave the alley, a sudden whistle pierced the air. Rex's ears flattened. He glanced over his shoulder to see 3 figures emerge from the shadows. "Well, look at that," one of them sneered. "Guess we found the dog that's been hanging around here." The tallest man stepped forward, eyes narrowing as he spotted the baby dangling from Rex's jaws. "Hand it over, mutt," Rex growled, his legs shifting into a defensive stance. The baby whimpered softly, her tiny hand peeking out from the sweatshirt. "I said hand it over." The man lunged, but Rex dodged swiftly, darting between 2 trash cans. The chase began, Rex's paws skidding against the icy pavement as he bolted through the alley. The men's footsteps thundered behind him. "Get that dog!" Rex ran, his muscles screaming in protest with each stride. His heart pounded not from fear, but from the weight of the life he carried. By the time Eve's corner came into view, Rex's legs felt like they might give out beneath him. His shoulder burned from where a sharp piece of metal had grazed him during the escape, but he didn't stop. He scratched at the cafe's door, barking urgently. Upstairs, Evelyn stirred from her sleep, frowning as she squinted at the clock. 2:17 a.m. "Rex," she mumbled, pulling on her robe. As she descended the stairs and approached the glass door, Evelyn's breath caught. Rex stood outside, his fur damp and bloodied, and in his mouth was a bundle, the baby's face peeking through. "Oh my God," she whispered, fumbling to unlock the door. As soon as it swung open, Rex stepped inside and gently laid the baby at her feet. Evelyn knelt, her fingers trembling as she touched the infant's forehead. "You're freezing," Evelyn murmured. She wrapped the baby in her coat, glancing down at Rex. "We're going to the hospital." Evelyn sat in the hospital's waiting area long after the police officer left, her fingers loosely clasped around a cup of lukewarm coffee from the vending machine. Rex lay at her feet, head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but still alert. The hum of the hospital, the distant footsteps of nurses, and the occasional beep of medical equipment created a strange kind of stillness that wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. Despite the warmth inside, Evelyn couldn't shake the lingering chill of the alley. The sight of the baby, pale and trembling, fragile beneath layers of fabric that did nothing to shield her from the brutal cold. Her thoughts drifted. Who had left that child there? The baby, so small and defenseless, hadn't ended up in that alley by accident. Evelyn's gut told her that much. Someone, perhaps out of desperation, had made the heartbreaking decision to leave her behind. Her gaze drifted toward the neonatal unit where the child now lay, monitored closely by machines. "I don't know what's going to happen to you," Evelyn whispered under her breath, the words nearly catching in her throat. Rex's ears twitched, his head tilting slightly as if sensing her unease. Evelyn let out a slow breath and shifted in her chair, brushing her fingertips along Rex's fur. "You always seem to know when something's wrong, don't you?" she murmured softly. "I don't know how you found her, but you saved her life." Rex didn't move, but the gentle thump of his tail against the linoleum floor spoke volumes. An hour later, Dr. Hayes appeared at the far end of the corridor. He approached quietly, hands tucked into the pockets of his white coat. His face was unreadable, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. Evelyn straightened. "How is she?" "She's stable," Dr. Hayes replied, his voice calm, but clipped. "Her temperature has returned to normal. We've scheduled her surgery for early next week." Evelyn nodded, relief flooding her chest. "Thank you." Dr. Hayes hesitated for a moment, glancing down at Rex. "There's something else," he said finally, lowering his voice. Evelyn's expression hardened. "What is it?" "We found signs of malnutrition," Dr. Hayes explained, crossing his arms. "It's clear she hadn't been cared for properly for quite some time. But there were no bruises, no external injuries. Whoever left her out there didn't hurt her physically, but they weren't able to take care of her either." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "She was starving?" Dr. Hayes nodded solemnly. "It's possible whoever abandoned her thought someone would find her sooner. But in this weather she wouldn't have lasted much longer." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Evelyn's eyes shifted toward the glass window, separating the waiting room from the neonatal unit. Through the glass, She could see the baby's tiny form beneath the soft glow of warming lights, her chest rising and falling steadily. Nurses hovered around, adjusting monitors and tending to the other infants. But Evelyn's focus remained fixed on the fragile child. "I want to see her," Evelyn said suddenly, rising to her feet. Dr. Hayes hesitated. "She's in a sterile environment for now, but I can make an exception, just for a few minutes." Evelyn gave a grateful nod. As Dr. Hayes led her down the corridor, Rex followed closely behind. The neonatal unit was quieter than the waiting area. The steady rhythm of heart monitors hummed softly, and Evelyn could hear the faint lull of classical music playing through overhead speakers, a calming attempt to soothe the tiny patients. Dr. Hayes gestured to an incubator near the window. "There she is," he said softly. Evelyn approached, her heart catching in her throat as she peered inside. The baby looked even smaller up close, her delicate features scrunched slightly as she slept. A small pink cap covered her head, and in 4 lines snaked down from her arm, delivering the nutrients her body so desperately needed. Evelyn gently placed her hand against the glass. "She deserves a name," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Dr. Hayes arched a brow. "Have one in mind?" Evelyn's eyes didn't leave the child. "Hope." Dr. Hayes was quiet for a moment before offering a small nod of approval. "It fits." Evelyn lingered there, hand pressed against the incubator, as if willing warmth and strength to pass through the glass. Behind her, Rex sat quietly, his gaze locked onto the sleeping infant. His tail gave another soft thump against the tile floor. Later that morning, as the first rays of sunlight bled through the hospital windows, Evelyn stood near the entrance, ready to head back to the cafe. Rex stood beside her, alert and ready to follow. Dr. Hayes met her at the door. "Evelyn," he said carefully. She paused, noting the tone in his voice. "I've spoken with Child Protective Services. If no relatives come forward, there's a chance the baby could be placed in a foster care." Evelyn's chest tightened. She hadn't thought that far ahead. In her mind, the focus had been getting the baby hope through the night. Now, the reality of what would happen next began to sink in. What if... Evelyn trailed off, swallowing hard. What if no one comes for her? Dr. Hayes studied her for a long moment, his eyes softening. Then she'll need someone to fight for her. The implication lingered heavily between them. Evelyn glanced down at Rex, who nudged her leg with his nose, as if urging her forward. "I'll visit her," Evelyn said quietly. "Every day if I have to." Dr. Hayes offered a faint smile. "I think that would mean a lot to her." "And to him," he added, glancing at Rex. Evelyn chuckled softly, running her hand through the fur on Rex's head. "Yeah, he's not going to let her out of his sight anytime soon." As Evelyn stepped out into the Chicago morning, the snow had stopped falling. The sky, once shrouded in thick clouds, began to clear, revealing soft hints of blue. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, glancing down at Rex, who trotted beside her, his golden coat glowing faintly in the early sunlight. The cafe was waiting, but for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt as though something had shifted within her. Hope wasn't just the baby's name. It was the feeling that had slowly begun to blossom in Evelyn's chest, fragile but very much alive. The bells above Eve's Corner Cafe jingled softly as Evelyn pushed open the door, shaking snow from her boots. Rex followed closely behind, his paws leaving damp prints across the tile floor. The cafe was still dim, the morning sun barely peeking through the large front window, casting long shadows along the wooden countertops. Evelyn flipped the sign on the door to open, but doubted anyone would come in this early. Her thoughts lingered at the hospital. She had left Hope in Dr. Hayes' care, promising to return later that evening. Yet, Evelyn's heart ached at the thought of that tiny baby lying alone in the incubator. There was something about the way she had found Hope, bundled helplessly in that alley, that stirred memories Evelyn had long tried to bury. The loss of Lucas, her son, felt distant yet raw, like a scar that never fully faded. Evelyn leaned against the counter, absently wiping down surfaces as Rex curled up by the window, watching snowflakes drift lazily down the street. Hours passed, and the cafe remained empty aside from a few regulars. a postman warming up with black coffee, and two college students tapping away at laptops. Rex remained a quiet sentinel by Evelyn's side, occasionally lifting his head when the door creaked open. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn found herself pacing behind the counter, her hands fidgeting with the edge of a dish towel. The uncertainty gnawed at her. Finally, she slipped out from behind the counter, tossing the towel aside. "Rex, let's go." His ears perked up immediately. Evelyn grabbed her coat, flipping the cafe sign to close before heading out into the cold once more. St. Mary's Hospital stood tall against the gray skyline, its facade plain and sterile. Evelyn strode through the front doors with Rex at her heels, ignoring the sideways glances from nurses as the golden retriever trotted confidently by her side. At the reception desk, the woman behind the counter frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but dogs aren't allowed past this point." "He's not just a dog," Evelyn replied, flashing a soft smile. "He's family." Before the receptionist could argue, Dr. Hayes' voice called out from the hallway. "It's all right," he said, approaching with his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "Let them through." Evelyn offered the receptionist an apologetic shrug before following Dr. Hayes down the long corridor. They walked in silence for a few moments, Rex's nails tapping softly against the tile floor. Evelyn finally broke the quiet. "How is she?" "She's stable," Dr. Hayes replied, though his voice carried a note of exhaustion. "But her condition is fragile. The heart defect is serious. Without the surgery—" He trailed off, but Evelyn understood the weight behind his words. They reached the neonatal unit, and Dr. Hayes led her to the viewing window. Hope lay swaddled beneath the soft glow of the incubator's lights. Her tiny chest rose and fell, each breath more precious than the last. "She's strong," Evelyn said quietly, almost as if trying to convince herself. Dr. Hayes crossed his arms, staring at the baby through the glass. "You seem attached to her," he observed. Evelyn nodded slowly. "I guess I am," she admitted. "It's hard not to be after everything." A long pause settled between them, filled only by the distant hum of hospital equipment. "Dr. Hayes," Evelyn began hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" He glanced at her, sensing the hesitation in her tone. "You mentioned the surgery," Evelyn continued. "But earlier, you didn't sound confident about performing it. Is there a reason?" Dr. Hayes exhaled, his gaze shifting back to the child beyond the glass. "I've done this surgery more times than I can count," he replied softly. "But 5 years ago, I lost a patient." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "A child?" Dr. Hayes nodded, his jaw tightening. "She was 6. A congenital heart defect, similar to Hope's. Everything was going smoothly until the final hour. One misstep, and she was gone." The weight of his words pressed heavily against the sterile walls of the hospital. "I haven't performed pediatric heart surgery since," Dr. Hayes admitted, his voice laced with guilt. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked quietly. Dr. Hayes met her gaze. "Because I was afraid," he said honestly. "Afraid of failing again." Evelyn glanced at Rex, who was now sitting quietly, his eyes fixed on Dr. Hayes. "Maybe it's not failure that should scare you," Evelyn murmured, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe it's letting fear stop you from saving someone who still has a chance." Dr. Hayes was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, he let out a breath and nodded. "I'll schedule the surgery for Friday." Evelyn smiled softly. "Thank you." As she turned to leave, Rex lingered by Dr. Hayes, gazing up at him with unwavering eyes. The doctor knelt down, running his hand gently over the dog's head. "You're braver than I am, aren't you?" he whispered with a faint chuckle. Rex wagged his tail once before trotting after Evelyn. Later that evening, Evelyn returned to the cafe. She flipped on the lights, their soft glow bathing the room in warmth. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time it wasn't a customer. Dr. Hayes stepped inside, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Coffee," Evelyn offered, already pouring a cup. He accepted it gratefully, settling into one of the chairs near the window. Rex curled up at his feet. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" Evelyn teased lightly. Dr. Hayes smirked. "Thought I'd check on the place that dog seems to think is his second home." Evelyn laughed quietly, but her gaze softened. "Thank you for what you're doing," she said sincerely. Dr. Hayes looked down into his cup, his expression unreadable. I just hope it's enough. Evelyn glanced out the window, watching as snow began to fall again, blanketing the streets in quiet serenity. It will be, she replied softly. The cafe fell silent, save for the soft crackling of the heater. Outside, the streets of Chicago stretched endlessly, cold and indifferent. But inside the small cafe, there was warmth, a fragile but steady reminder that even in the darkest corners of the city, hope had found a way to survive. The day of the surgery arrived cloaked in a cold, relentless snowfall. The streets outside St. Mary's Hospital were quiet, muffled by layers of white, as if the city itself held its breath. Evelyn sat in the waiting room, her fingers wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Rex lay curled at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained fixed on the double doors leading to the operating room. Hope's surgery was scheduled for 10 a.m. Evelyn had been there since dawn. She couldn't stay at the cafe. Not today. Her heart wouldn't let her. Across the waiting room, Dr. Hayes paced near the window, staring out into the snow-covered street below. The same exhaustion lingered in his posture, but there was something else too: resolve. Do you think she'll make it? Evelyn asked, breaking the silence. Dr. Hayes turned, his gaze softening as he met her eyes. She's strong, he said, echoing the same words Evelyn had whispered days earlier. But this surgery, it's complicated. Evelyn nodded, swallowing hard. I know, she replied quietly. But she's lucky to have you. Dr. Hayes glanced at Rex, who lifted his head slightly at the mention of luck. Maybe, Hayes murmured, or maybe she's lucky to have him. Evelyn followed his gaze, reaching down to run her hand along Rex's fur. Rex saved her once, she said softly. I'm hoping he doesn't have to do it again. An hour later, Dr. Hayes disappeared through the operating room doors, leaving Evelyn and Rex alone in the waiting area. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching longer than the last. Evelyn tried to distract herself. She read old magazines, paced the hallway, and stared at vending machines she had no intention of using. But no matter what she did, her mind circled back to Hope, lying small and vulnerable on that surgical table. Rex stayed close, sensing her unease. Occasionally, he'd nudge her leg or rest his chin on her knee, offering silent comfort. The waiting stretched on. Inside the operating room, the tension was palpable. The overhead lights cast a harsh glow over the surgical table where Hope lay, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, steady breaths. Dr. Hayes stood at the head of the table, his gloved hands hovering over her fragile body. The monitor beside him beeped in a slow, rhythmic pattern, a reminder that every second mattered. Nurse Patel, Hayes called, his voice steady but low. Scalpel. A slender nurse handed him the instrument without hesitation. Patel had been working with Hayes for years, and even she noticed the slight tremor in his hands. Deep breath, doctor, she whispered, offering a reassuring glance over her mask. Hayes met her gaze briefly, then exhaled, steadying himself. This wasn't the first time he'd performed this surgery, but it was the first since his last failure. The ghost of that memory lingered at the edge of his mind, the child he couldn't save. But this time, he wouldn't let fear control him. Not today. The surgery progressed carefully, each incision deliberate and precise. Dr. Hayes moved with the focus of a man determined not to let history repeat itself. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. Hope's heart was exposed, the defect clearly visible beneath the bright surgical light. Hayes carefully began the delicate process of repairing the tiny valve, his hands steady now, driven by purpose rather than hesitation. But then the monitors blared. Hope's heart rate began to drop. Dr. Hayes' head snapped toward the screen. What's happening? Patel asked urgently. She's going into cardiac arrest, Hayes replied, his voice sharp with tension. We need to stabilize her now. Patel grabbed the defibrillator, her hands moving swiftly as she prepared the paddles. Charging, she said. Dr. Hayes pressed the paddles to Hope's chest. Clear. A jolt coursed through her tiny body, causing her to twitch slightly. The monitor beeped, but the heart rate remained dangerously low. Hayes clenched his jaw. Again. Another shock. Still nothing. Patel's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Hayes felt the weight of defeat creeping in. Not again. He gritted his teeth, placing his hand gently over Hope's chest, almost as if willing her heart to keep beating. "Come on, kid," Hayes muttered under his breath. For a long, agonizing second, the room held its collective breath. Then, a faint beep. The monitor flickered back to life, slow but steady. Patel exhaled, relief washing over her. "She's stabilizing," she whispered. Hayes stepped back, shoulders sagging as the tension drained from his body. But the battle wasn't over. "Let's finish this," Hayes said, voice firm once more. The rest of the surgery proceeded without complication. Back in the waiting room, Evelyn sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on the double doors. The clock now read 3:30 p.m. Rex's ears perked up moments before the doors finally swung open, revealing Dr. Hayes. Evelyn shot to her feet. "Well?" she asked, heart pounding. Dr. Hayes removed his mask, revealing a tired but relieved smile. "She made it," he said simply. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. "Thank you," she breathed. Dr. Hayes nodded. "She's a fighter," he replied, glancing down at Rex. "Just like this guy?" Rex wagged his tail, his eyes bright with curiosity, as if asking, "Can I see her?" "She's resting now, but you can visit her soon," Dr. Hayes assured them. Evelyn crouched beside Rex, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You did it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved her again." Rex nuzzled against her, his tail thumping against the floor. Later that evening, Evelyn sat beside Hope's crib in the hospital's recovery room. The baby slept peacefully, her tiny hands curled into soft fists. The monitors beeped steadily, a comforting rhythm in the quiet room. Dr. Hayes entered, his coat draped over his arm. "How's she doing?" Evelyn asked softly. "Better than I expected," Hayes replied, stepping closer to the crib. "If everything continues this way, she'll make a full recovery." Evelyn brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, eyes never leaving Hope. "Thank you for not giving up," she said, glancing at Hayes. Dr. Hayes smiled faintly. "I think she's the one who didn't give up," he replied. Rex lay by the crib, his watchful gaze fixed on Hope. "She's got a guardian," Hayes added, nodding toward Rex. "And so do you." Evelyn smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears. "We all do." The following morning, sunlight poured softly through the hospital room windows, cutting through the frost that had gathered overnight. The snowstorm had passed, leaving behind a city glazed in white. The streets below were slowly coming to life as Chicago shook off the remnants of winter's grip. Evelyn sat by Hope's bedside, a cup of lukewarm hospital coffee in hand. Her eyes traced the soft rise and fall of the baby's chest, comforted by the steady rhythm of the monitor beside her. Rex lay curled at the foot of the crib, his head resting on his front paws as if he had appointed himself as Hope's permanent guardian. Evelyn hadn't left the hospital since the surgery. Every nurse that passed the room smiled at the sight, a golden retriever standing vigil over the smallest patient. Dr. Hayes had checked in twice already that morning, offering quiet reassurances and small updates, but Evelyn knew he was just being polite. She could see the relief in his eyes. Hope had made it through. By late afternoon, Dr. Hayes stepped into the room once more, clipboard tucked under his arm. "How's she doing?" Evelyn asked softly, setting her coffee aside. "She's responding well," Hayes replied, standing at the edge of the crib to review the monitor. "Her vitals are strong, and if this keeps up, she'll be able to leave the hospital within a week." Evelyn let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said, the words barely audible but filled with sincerity. Dr. Hayes glanced toward Rex, who lifted his head as if sensing the doctor's gaze. "You're going to have a hard time keeping him away once she's discharged," Hayes mused, scratching behind Rex's ears. Evelyn chuckled softly. "I think he's made that pretty clear." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the weight of the past few days slowly giving way to something lighter, something closer to hope. But that peace was short-lived. That evening, as Evelyn prepared to leave for the night, A quiet knock echoed from the hospital room's door. She glanced up, expecting to see Nurse Patel or another staff member. Instead, a young police officer stepped inside, his hat tucked under one arm, notebook in the other. "Ms. Carter?" he asked gently. Evelyn's shoulders stiffened. "Yes, I'm Officer Callahan. I'm here to follow up on the child's case. May I have a few minutes of your time?" Evelyn exchanged a glance with Rex, who had now sat up, ears twitching at the change in tone. "Of course," she replied carefully, motioning for the officer to sit. Callahan took the seat across from her, flipping open his notebook. "I understand you were the one who brought the infant in," he began. "Yes. Rex found her," Evelyn said, nodding toward the dog by her side. Callahan glanced at Rex, eyebrows raised. "Right. The hero dog the nurses were talking about." He jotted something down. "Can you tell me again exactly how you found her?" Evelyn recounted the events of that night. The sound of crying in the alley, Rex leading her to the plastic bin, and the frantic rush to the hospital. As she spoke, Callahan listened intently, occasionally scribbling notes, but saying little. When she finished, he set his pen down and folded his hands over his knee. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "we've been investigating a string of abandoned infants across the city. In the last 6 months, Hope is the 5th child we've found." Evelyn's breath caught. "5," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Callahan nodded gravely. "Most were left in similar conditions: alleyways, public parks, places where someone might eventually find them. But this is the first case where no missing persons report was filed." Evelyn's eyes shifted to Hope, still sleeping peacefully. "What does that mean?" "It means," Callahan said slowly, "that whoever left her behind didn't expect her to be found." The weight of those words hung heavily in the room. Evelyn looked at Hope, so small, so fragile, and felt something deep within her tighten. "Are you saying someone wanted to hurt her?" Evelyn's voice trembled, but anger laced her tone. Callahan hesitated. "We don't know that for sure. But what we do know is that whoever left her hasn't come forward. And that raises concerns." Evelyn's hands balled into fists at her sides. "So what happens now?" "The state will take custody once she's released," Callahan explained. "If no family comes forward, she'll be placed into foster care." Evelyn's heart sank. Foster care, a system she knew all too well, could be unpredictable. "Can I apply to foster her?" Evelyn asked suddenly, the words leaving her lips before she had fully processed them. Callahan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You'd have to go through the proper channels, but yes, it's possible." Evelyn nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "Then I want to. I can't just let her go." The officer regarded her for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll add that to my report." He stood, offering her a polite but firm smile. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Carter. And thank you for what you've done for her." Evelyn watched as he left, her mind already racing with possibilities. Later that night, Evelyn sat by the window of her cafe, staring out at the snow-covered streets. Rex lay at her feet, resting after the long day, but even in sleep, his ears twitched occasionally at passing footsteps outside. Her heart felt heavy. The thought of Hope being placed in foster care unsettled her. She couldn't explain it, the bond that had formed between them, the sense of responsibility that tugged at her. All Evelyn knew was that she couldn't let that baby slip away into the system. Rex stirred, lifting his head and resting it on her knee. "You agree, don't you?" Evelyn whispered, scratching gently behind his ears. "She belongs with us." Rex's tail thumped softly against the floor in response. And just like that, Evelyn made her decision. She wasn't sure how or when, but one way or another, Hope was coming home. The following week passed in a blur. Evelyn returned to the hospital each day, spending long hours by Hope's side. She brought books to read aloud, small blankets she had knitted during the quiet evenings at the cafe, and occasionally slipped Rex inside, much to the amusement of the nurses. Hope's health improved steadily, her cheeks slowly regaining color. Dr. Hayes was optimistic, often stopping by to check on her progress. But beneath Evelyn's quiet care and affection, worry churned. The words of Officer Callahan haunted her. Whoever left her behind didn't expect her to be found. The thought that someone had intentionally abandoned Hope, Perhaps even wished her gone. Unsettled Evelyn deeply. Rex could sense it. He remained closer than ever, rarely letting Evelyn out of his sight. On the day of Hope's discharge, Evelyn bundled her carefully into a soft yellow blanket. Dr. Hayes stood by the doorway, arms crossed. "She's healthy enough to leave now," he said with a small smile. "But Evelyn, are you sure about this?" Evelyn glanced down at the child in her arms, who gazed up at her with sleepy eyes. "I'm sure," Evelyn replied. "She doesn't have anyone else." Dr. Hayes hesitated, but eventually nodded. "I'll sign the temporary custody papers, but I want regular checkups. Her heart needs monitoring." Evelyn smiled warmly. "Of course." As she turned to leave, Rex trotted ahead of her, tail wagging as if he knew Hope was finally coming home. The cafe felt different with Hope in it. Evelyn had converted Lucas's old room upstairs, turning it into a nursery filled with soft toys and pastel blankets. She tried not to think too much about the past as she carefully tucked Hope into the crib each night, but memories crept in. Some nights, Evelyn would sit by the crib long after Hope had fallen asleep, watching the baby's chest rise and fall to the same steady rhythm that once lulled her son to sleep. Rex often lay near the doorway, silently keeping watch over them both. But the peace was short-lived. It began 3 days later. Evelyn noticed a woman standing across the street from the cafe, tall, slender, with long dark hair pulled into a loose braid. She wore a worn-out coat and stood beneath the flickering street lamp for what felt like hours, eyes fixed on the building. At first, Evelyn dismissed it as coincidence. But then the woman returned the next day, and the day after that. By the fourth day, Evelyn's nerves frayed. Late in the evening, as Evelyn wiped down the cafe's tables, she caught sight of the woman again, standing in the same spot, hands clenched tightly by her sides. This time, Evelyn decided to confront her. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tightly around her. "Can I help you?" Evelyn called, crossing the street. The woman's eyes flickered nervously, as if caught doing something she shouldn't. She took a step back, shaking her head. "No, I'm sorry. I was just—" Her voice trembled. "You've been out here for days," Evelyn pressed, softening her tone. "If you need something, just say it." The woman hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window upstairs, toward Hope's room. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. "You're her mother, aren't you?" The woman's face paled, and tears welled in her eyes. I didn't know what else to do," the woman whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't take care of her." Evelyn's heart pounded as she took a careful step closer. "What's your name?" "Olivia," the woman said quietly, brushing tears from her cheeks. "Her name is Emily, not Hope." Evelyn's throat tightened. The baby, Hope, had a name, a mother, a history Evelyn hadn't known. Back inside the cafe, Evelyn sat Olivia at the corner table, offering her a cup of hot tea. Rex lay quietly nearby, though his eyes remained fixed on Olivia, watching her closely. "Why did you leave her there?" Evelyn asked gently, though she feared the answer. Olivia stared into her cup, her fingers trembling against the ceramic. "I was alone," Olivia began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily's father. He left when I told him I was pregnant. I lost my job, and I couldn't afford to keep our apartment. I bounced between shelters, but none of them would take both of us. I thought I could handle it." Her voice cracked, and Evelyn felt her heart sink. "But it got harder. I ran out of options, and the nights got colder. Emily was sick. I knew she wouldn't make it if I kept her with me." Tears slipped down Olivia's cheeks. "I thought if I left her somewhere, someone would find her. Someone better than me." Evelyn's chest tightened. "She almost didn't make it," Evelyn said softly, her voice trembling. "If Rex hadn't found her—" "I know," Olivia whispered, clutching her coat tightly. "I came back, but she was already gone." Evelyn took a long breath, struggling to suppress the swirl of emotions rising within her. "I'm sorry," Olivia added, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to lose her forever. I just didn't know how to ask for help." Evelyn sat in silence, the weight of Olivia's words pressing down on her. "She's upstairs," Evelyn said finally. "Sleeping." Olivia's eyes widened, and fresh tears welled. Can I see her?" Evelyn hesitated, Her protective instincts flared instantly, but the desperate look in Olivia's eyes held her still. "All right," Evelyn said softly, "but just for a moment." Upstairs, Olivia stood by the crib, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as she gazed at her daughter. Hope, Emily, slept soundly, unaware of the weight surrounding her tiny existence. Evelyn watched from the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. "She's safe here," Evelyn said quietly. Olivia nodded. "I know." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The soft ticking of the clock filled the space between them. Finally, Olivia turned, her eyes filled with longing and sorrow. "I don't know if I deserve to have her back," she admitted, "but I want to try. I want to be better for her." Evelyn met her gaze, searching for answers in the tear-streaked face of a mother desperate to reunite with her child. "We'll figure it out," Evelyn said at last, though uncertainty hung in the air. Olivia's lips trembled into a faint, grateful smile. "Thank you." As Evelyn walked Olivia to the door, Rex watched carefully, his steady eyes lingering on Olivia as if silently assessing her intentions. "I'm not sure how this will play out," Evelyn admitted to Rex after Olivia had gone. Rex let out a quiet huff, resting his head on his paws. "But I know one thing," Evelyn whispered, glancing toward Hope's room. "She deserves a family, even if it's not perfect." Evelyn sat alone at the cafe's corner table, stirring a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Outside, the streets of Chicago lay blanketed in soft snow, muffling the hum of the city. The cafe was closed for the evening, but Evelyn hadn't gone upstairs yet. Hope slept soundly in her crib, and Rex lay curled at Evelyn's feet, his golden fur warm against the hardwood floor. Her thoughts drifted to Olivia, Hope's mother. It had been 3 days since Olivia's quiet, tearful visit. 3 days since Evelyn watched her stand by Hope's crib, her fragile hands trembling as she reached out but dared not touch. Olivia hadn't returned since, but her absence lingered like a shadow. Evelyn knew Olivia's story wasn't unique. Single mothers, broken homes, and impossible choices. She had seen it before. But knowing didn't make the decision any easier. She wanted to protect Hope. She had grown attached, too attached. The thought of handing Hope back to the same world that had abandoned her once filled Evelyn with dread. But then there was Olivia, a mother desperate to be reunited with her child. She deserves a family, even if it's not perfect. Evelyn sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Rex," she murmured, running her hand through the retriever's fur. "Am I doing the right thing?" Rex lifted his head slightly, giving her a soft thump of his tail against the floor, as if reassuring her. The quiet was interrupted by a knock at the door. Evelyn's heart jumped. It was after hours. She glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. Through the glass, Olivia stood outside, clutching her coat tightly around her thin frame. Evelyn hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. The cold air swept in as Olivia stepped inside, snowflakes melting instantly on the cafe's floor. "I'm sorry," Olivia began, her voice soft and unsure. "I didn't mean to bother you this late." "It's all right," Evelyn replied, motioning to the nearest table. "Come in. Sit down." Olivia hesitated, but eventually slipped into a chair near the window, rubbing her hands together to warm them. Rex padded over, sitting beside her with a quiet wag of his tail. Olivia smiled weakly, leaning down to scratch behind his ears. "You're lucky to have him," she said softly. "I know," Evelyn replied. "He's been a constant." Silence stretched between them, fragile but not uncomfortable. Finally, Olivia broke the quiet. "I've been thinking about Emily," Olivia began, her eyes fixed on the window fogged with condensation. Evelyn sat up straighter, listening intently. "I want to try," Olivia continued, her voice wavering. "I want to be in her life. I know I made mistakes, and I can't take back what happened, but I need to try." Evelyn studied the woman across from her. There was fear in Olivia's eyes, but beneath it was something else, determination. "Being a mother isn't easy," Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm. "You left her once. How do I know it won't happen again?" Olivia's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I've been looking for work. I found a place to stay, It's small, but it's safe. She looked up, meeting Evelyn's gaze directly. I'm not the same person I was that night. I'm trying to be better. Evelyn wanted to believe her, but doubt lingered. She needs stability, Evelyn said gently. Consistency. Can you give her that? I can't, Olivia whispered. I will. Evelyn remained silent, her heart warring with itself. Part of her wanted to hold on, to keep hope safe, to ensure she grew up in the warmth of Evelyn's cafe, surrounded by love and security. But Evelyn wasn't Hope's mother. She had to face that truth. Would you let me see her? Olivia asked carefully, breaking through Evelyn's thoughts. Evelyn hesitated, glancing toward the stairs that led to Hope's room. After a long pause, she nodded. All right, Evelyn said softly. Come on. Upstairs. The room was quiet except for the faint creak of floorboards beneath their feet. Evelyn led Olivia into the small nursery, where Hope lay peacefully in her crib, the soft light of the moon casting shadows along the walls. Olivia stopped at the edge of the crib, clutching the rail with trembling fingers. She's beautiful, Olivia whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Evelyn stood nearby, watching carefully. I didn't deserve her, Olivia continued, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. But I want to now. Evelyn's heart ached at the vulnerability in Olivia's voice. Then prove it, Evelyn said softly. Olivia turned, her eyes searching Evelyn's face. I will, she promised. For a moment, the two women stood in silence, connected by the fragile life between them. The following week, Evelyn began easing Olivia into Hope's life. At first, Olivia would visit the cafe during the day, sitting quietly with Hope while Evelyn worked nearby. She'd feed her, change her, and gently rock her to sleep under Evelyn's watchful eye. Rex always lingered close, as if sensing the delicate shift in their world. Slowly, Evelyn's walls began to lower. She saw the way Olivia looked at Hope, with love, regret, and hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One evening, as Evelyn cleaned the cafe, Olivia approached her, holding Hope in her arms. I want to take her home, Olivia said carefully. Evelyn froze, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She's ready, Olivia added. And so am I. Evelyn's heart twisted, but she knew this day was coming. She set down the dish towel and approached Olivia, gently brushing her hand against Hope's tiny fingers. Take care of her, Evelyn said softly. And if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she nodded. Thank you, she whispered. Rex padded over, sitting beside Evelyn as they watched Olivia walk toward the door, Hope cradled in her arms. As the door closed behind them, Evelyn felt the ache of loss settle into her chest. But alongside it was something else, peace. She's going to be all right, Evelyn said quietly, mostly to herself. Rex nudged her leg, as if agreeing. And as Evelyn looked out into the snowy Chicago night, she realized that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. For Hope, for Olivia, and for her. The cafe felt quieter than it ever had before. Evelyn stood by the front window, gazing out at the snow-dusted street as evening descended over South Side Chicago. Across the street, holiday lights flickered faintly in the cold, illuminating storefronts and parked cars. Everything looked the same, but the absence upstairs weighed on Evelyn's chest. For the first time in weeks, Hope's crib was empty. Rex lay near the counter, his head resting on his front paws, eyes flickering open at the faintest sound from outside. He hadn't strayed far from Evelyn since Olivia took Hope home 3 days ago. It was as if he felt the same strange emptiness. You miss her too, huh? Evelyn asked softly, wiping down the counter with slow, methodical motions. Rex's tail thumped once, a quiet confirmation. It was odd, Evelyn thought, how quickly Hope had become woven into their lives. Her soft coos, the faint rustle of blankets, even the midnight cries that had once jolted Evelyn from sleep, all of it had left behind an imprint. The house, the cafe, felt too still without her. And yet, Evelyn knew she had done the right thing. Later that evening, Evelyn closed the cafe early. The snow had picked up outside, swirling in thick gusts beneath the streetlights. Customers had long since retreated indoors, leaving the streets deserted. As she turned the sign to closed and dimmed the lights, Evelyn hesitated by the door, gazing up at the dark windows of the apartment above. She climbed the stairs slowly, her footsteps echoing softly through the empty hallway. The nursery door was ajar, and Evelyn paused at the threshold, peering inside. The crib sat untouched, the soft pastel blankets still neatly folded. A small stuffed rabbit rested by the pillow, left behind in the rush of Hope's departure. Evelyn stepped inside, brushing her hand lightly over the crib's edge. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember the late-night feedings, the quiet moments by the window, and the soft weight of Hope in her arms. But just as quickly, she let the memory fade. Hope was where she needed to be. The next morning, Evelyn reopened the cafe. A few regulars drifted in, exchanging pleasantries over steaming cups of coffee, but Evelyn's mind wandered. By noon, the bell above the door jingled softly, and Evelyn glanced up, expecting another familiar face. Instead, Olivia stood there, bundled in a thick winter coat, Hope cradled in her arms. Rex's head shot up immediately, his tail wagging as he bounded toward them, nuzzling Olivia's leg before gently sniffing at Hope. "Hey there, buddy," Olivia laughed softly, shifting Hope so Rex could rest his nose against her tiny fingers. Evelyn's heart warmed at the sight. "Olivia," Evelyn greeted, stepping out from behind the counter. "I wasn't expecting to see you so soon." Olivia smiled sheepishly, gently bouncing Hope in her arms. "I thought we'd stop by," Olivia said, her voice soft. Hope was getting fussy. "I thought maybe seeing you and Rex might help." Evelyn's chest tightened at the sound of Hope's real name. She still wasn't used to it. To her, she would always be Hope. "You can call her whatever feels right," Olivia added, as if sensing Evelyn's hesitation. Evelyn smiled, gesturing toward a table near the window. "Come on in. Let me make you something warm." Over the next hour, Evelyn watched as Olivia settled into the corner booth, cradling Hope close while sipping a cup of tea. Rex sat loyally by their side, his eyes fixed protectively on the baby. "She's growing fast," Evelyn commented, watching as Hope's tiny fingers curled around Olivia's. "She is," Olivia agreed, her voice tinged with awe. "It's like she changes every day." Evelyn smiled, but said nothing. Instead, she busied herself behind the counter, grateful for the life that now filled the cafe once more. As Olivia prepared to leave, she hesitated by the door, glancing back at Evelyn. "I just wanted to say thank you," Olivia said softly, tightening her hold on Hope. "For everything. You didn't have to do any of this, but you did." Evelyn met her gaze, feeling a flicker of warmth spread through her chest. "I think," Evelyn replied, choosing her words carefully, "sometimes people come into our lives when we need them most. And sometimes we're meant to protect them, even if only for a little while." Olivia's eyes shimmered with tears, and she nodded. "She's lucky to have you in her life," Olivia whispered. "And I'm lucky to have both of you in mine," Evelyn replied sincerely. In the weeks that followed, Olivia and Hope became regular visitors at the cafe. Olivia would often stop by for tea, allowing Evelyn to hold Hope while she took rare moments for herself. Rex remained ever vigilant, staying close to Hope's side whenever she was near. It wasn't the same as before, but in many ways it was better. Evelyn watched as Olivia grew more confident, settling into motherhood with a quiet determination that had once seemed distant. And while Evelyn missed those quiet nights with Hope upstairs, she found comfort in the knowledge that she had helped, that she had made a difference. One afternoon, as Evelyn locked up the cafe, Dr. Hayes appeared at the door. "Doctor," Evelyn greeted warmly, pulling her coat tight against the chill. "I thought I'd stop by," Hayes said, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "Checking in on Hope." "She's doing great," Evelyn replied with a soft smile. "She was here with Olivia this morning." Hayes nodded thoughtfully, his eyes drifting toward Rex, who sat patiently by Evelyn's side. "I have to say," Hayes added, "I wasn't sure how things would turn out. But you've built something here, Evelyn, something important." Evelyn glanced back at the cafe's glowing sign, soft light spilling onto the sidewalk. "I didn't do it alone," Evelyn replied, resting her hand gently on Rex's head. Hayes chuckled. No, I suppose not. That evening, Evelyn stood outside the cafe, watching the snow fall softly around her. She thought of the night Rex had brought hope into her life. The cold, the desperation, and the fragile bond that had formed in those quiet, fleeting moments. Now, as she gazed down at Rex, his tail swishing gently against the snow, Evelyn felt something shift within her. Hope wasn't just a child's name. It was a reminder of resilience, of second chances, and of the quiet strength that carried them all forward. "Come on, boy," Evelyn said softly, nudging Rex toward the door. "Let's go home." And as they disappeared inside, the warmth of the cafe embraced them once more, a beacon against the cold. Winter melted into spring, and with it, life in South Side Chicago bloomed quietly. The snow that once blanketed the streets faded, replaced by budding flowers pushing through cracks in the pavement. The days stretched longer, and the warmth of the sun filtered through the large front windows of Eve's Corner Cafe, casting soft golden light over the wooden tables. Evelyn stood behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, but her gaze lingered on the corner booth near the window, Olivia's booth. It was the same spot where, not long ago, Hope had rested in Olivia's arms, watched over by Rex as if the baby belonged to him as much as to anyone else. The cafe felt fuller on the days they visited, as if their presence breathed life into the quiet space. Now, though, the booth sat empty. It had been a week since Olivia last stopped by. Evelyn knew better than to worry. Olivia was doing well, rebuilding her life and finding steady ground beneath her feet. Still, there was a subtle ache Evelyn couldn't quite shake. Hope had left a mark. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, the familiar jingle of the doorbell echoed through the cafe. Evelyn glanced up, and a smile immediately tugged at the corners of her lips. Olivia stepped inside, her coat draped over one arm, while Hope rested against her chest, bundled in a light blanket despite the warmer weather. Rex, who had been napping by the counter, shot up instantly, his tail wagging furiously as he padded over to greet them. "Hey there, Rex," Olivia laughed softly, crouching to let Hope's tiny hand brush against his fur. The baby cooed, gripping a handful of golden fluff as Rex patiently stood still. Evelyn stepped out from behind the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I was wondering when you'd come by," she teased lightly, pulling out a chair for Olivia. "Things have been busy," Olivia admitted as she sat down, adjusting Hope in her lap. "I found a part-time job. Nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. I just wanted to come by and thank you again for everything." Evelyn sat across from her, folding her hands over the table. "You don't need to thank me," Evelyn said softly. "I'm just glad to see you both doing well." Hope squirmed in Olivia's lap, reaching out toward Rex, who had taken his place beside them like a permanent fixture. She asked about him. Olivia chuckled, gently bouncing Hope. "Well, in her own way." Evelyn smiled warmly. "He's pretty attached to her, too," Evelyn replied, scratching behind Rex's ears. "I think he's convinced she's part of his pack." The cafe settled into a comfortable hum as the evening crowd trickled in. The smell of fresh pastries and coffee filled the air, blending with the soft murmur of conversations. Later that evening, as the cafe quieted, Olivia lingered by the counter, rocking Hope gently as she began to doze. "She's growing so fast," Evelyn noted, watching Hope's eyes flutter shut. Olivia's smile softened, but there was something else in her expression, hesitation. "She is," Olivia agreed, but her gaze drifted down to the cup in her hands. "Sometimes, I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I can give her what she really needs." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You're doing more than enough, Olivia," she reassured her. "I see it every time you're with her. She's happy. She's loved." Olivia exhaled slowly, brushing a hand over Hope's dark curls. I guess I just don't want to let her down." Evelyn's chest tightened at the familiar weight of those words. She remembered feeling the same way about Lucas, that nagging fear of falling short, of not being enough. "You won't," Evelyn said simply. "The fact that you're here, that you're trying, that's what matters. You're giving her something more important than anything else." Olivia glanced up, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What's that?" "You," Evelyn replied softly. A long silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt lighter, filled with understanding that only mothers, even those brought together by fate, could share. Before Olivia left, Evelyn walked her to the door, Rex trailing closely behind. As the door swung open, a breeze swept in, rustling the hanging plants by the window. Olivia paused, adjusting Hope's blanket. "I was thinking," Olivia began carefully. "Maybe when Hope's older, I'll tell her everything. About how you and Rex found her. About how she got a second chance because of you." Evelyn felt her heart swell. "I'd like that," she said with a soft smile. As Olivia stepped out into the fading light, Evelyn watched them disappear down the street, Hope's tiny hand gripping Olivia's coat. Rex sat by the door, his eyes fixed on them until they were out of sight. "She's in good hands," Evelyn whispered, brushing her hand through Rex's fur. And somehow, she knew Rex agreed. That night, Evelyn returned to the nursery upstairs, though she knew the crib would be empty. She lingered by the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the soft toys and blankets neatly arranged inside. There was no sadness this time, only warmth. Hope had left, but her presence remained, woven into the very fabric of Evelyn's life. Evelyn stepped forward, gently lifting the small stuffed rabbit from the crib. She smiled, brushing a speck of dust from its ear. "I guess we'll hold on to this," she said softly to Rex, who watched from the hallway. "Just in case she visits." Rex wagged his tail, following Evelyn as she turned off the light and gently closed the door behind her. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons shifted once more. The cafe continued to thrive, and Olivia and Hope became a part of the rhythm of Evelyn's life. Evelyn never stopped watching out for them, quietly offering support, a warm place to rest, and the unwavering loyalty of a golden retriever who had once saved a child from the cold. In the end, Hope wasn't just a child's name. She was a symbol of new beginnings, of resilience, and of the quiet, powerful ways in which love finds its way into even the coldest corners. And as Evelyn stood in the doorway of her cafe one spring evening, Rex sitting faithfully beside her, she realized that sometimes hope doesn't just find you. Sometimes you choose to hold on to it.